Thomas Jenkins was enjoying the quiet evening in his mountain cabin, just as he had for the past decade since retiring. His old hands moved slowly but deliberately as he made himself a simple dinner, beans and cornbread, a comfort meal from his childhood. Outside, the Appalachian forest was peaceful, crickets chirping as darkness settled over the pines. He didn't notice the strange quietness that suddenly fell over the woods. The crickets stopped, the night birds went silent, and even the gentle breeze seemed to hold its breath. A soft blue light filtered through his kitchen window, casting odd shadows across the wooden floor. Thomas looked up from his dinner, a slight frown crossing his weathered face. At 78, he'd seen enough strange things in his lifetime not to be easily startled, but something felt wrong. Very wrong. Probably just some hikers with those fancy new LED headlamps, he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of his neck, an old feeling he hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being watched. He set down his fork and stood up slowly, his knees protesting after a long day of gardening. Making his way to the window, Thomas peered out into the darkness. The blue light was brighter now, coming from somewhere above his cabin. Not hikers, then. "What in the world?" he whispered. Before he could make sense of what he was seeing, there was a high-pitched hum that made his fillings ache. The cabin door burst open without warning, and Thomas found himself face to face with something impossible. They weren't human. That much was immediately clear. Tall, blue-skinned creatures with large, dark eyes stood in his doorway. Their bodies were thin but strong-looking, covered in what appeared to be some kind of sleek uniform. Thomas blinked hard, wondering if his old mind was finally playing tricks on him. "You will come with us," said the tallest one in strangely accented English. Thomas surprised himself with his own calmness. Perhaps it was the decades of training, or maybe just the shock, but instead of fear, he felt a strange resignation wash over him. "At least let me turn off the stove," he said quietly. The creatures looked at each other, seemingly confused by his lack of panic. The leader, who Thomas would later learn was called Commander Dew, nodded once. Thomas moved slowly to his stove, turned off the burner, and placed his half-eaten dinner in the sink. His eyes darted briefly to the drawer where he kept his old service pistol. It was only a few steps away, but somehow he knew it wouldn't make a difference against whatever technology these beings possessed. Instead, he reached for the small wooden box on his counter, opening it to touch the worn dog tags inside. A final connection to who he had once been. "Leave that," barked one of the smaller creatures, Officer Sung, raising what looked like a weapon. Thomas closed the box and turned toward them. "I'm ready then," he said simply. What happened next was disorienting. A beam of light surrounded him, and Thomas felt a floating sensation as his feet left the floor. His old body tingled uncomfortably as he was lifted through the ceiling of his cabin, right through the solid wood as if it weren't there, and up toward a massive ship hovering silently above the trees. The last thing Thomas saw before losing consciousness was his small cabin growing smaller below him, the only home he'd known for years disappearing into the darkness of the forest. When Thomas awoke, he was lying on a cold, metallic surface. The room around him hummed with strange technology, panels of flickering lights, curved walls that seemed to glow from within, and a large window showing the stars outside. Earth was visible too, a beautiful blue marble hanging in the blackness of space. Captain Bay, a stern-looking alien with markings that distinguished him from the others, stood watching as Thomas slowly sat up. "The specimen is awake," Bay announced to others in the room. Thomas rubbed his forehead, looking around at the alien faces studying him with curious intensity. There were at least 6 of them, all with the same blue skin and large eyes, but with subtle differences in height and markings. Some wore what looked like armor, others simpler uniforms. "Where am I?" Thomas asked, his voice steadier than he expected. "You are aboard the Gook survey vessel," Commander Dew replied, stepping forward. "You have been selected for study before our species makes formal contact with your planet." Thomas almost laughed. "Study? You mean invasion, don't you?" The aliens exchanged glances, clearly surprised by his perception. "You are very calm for a primitive being facing superior life forms," observed one of them, leaning closer to examine him. Thomas simply shrugged. "I've seen worse," he said quietly. And it was true. Though none of the aliens could possibly know it yet, Thomas Jenkins was far from the helpless old man they thought they had captured. What they didn't realize was that the slight tremor in his hands wasn't from fear or old age. It was from decades of adrenaline and combat, from years of holding lives in those same hands. As the aliens began preparing their equipment for whatever tests they had planned, Thomas watched them carefully, noting exits, counting weapons, assessing threats, old habits deeply ingrained. He didn't struggle when they secured him to the examination table, didn't protest when they attached monitoring devices to his temples and chest. Instead, he waited patiently, conserving his energy, gathering information. These aliens had made a terrible mistake. They had chosen their human specimen very, very poorly, and soon they would learn just how badly they had miscalculated. The aliens wasted no time beginning their tests on Thomas. A curved glass panel descended from the ceiling, bathing him in soft green light as it scanned his body from head to toe. Commander Du stood nearby, arms crossed over his thin blue chest, watching with obvious interest. "This specimen appears significantly older than optimal," said Medical Officer Han, studying the results appearing on a floating screen. "Muscle mass is reduced. Bone density shows typical human aging patterns." Thomas lay still, saying nothing, but his eyes took in everything: the layout of the room, the positions of each alien, the way their technology worked, old habits from a lifetime of training. "Age is irrelevant," Commander Du replied sharply. "We need to understand human weaknesses before the invasion force arrives. This one will serve that purpose adequately." Thomas almost smiled at that. They thought they'd picked an easy target. Officer Han pressed something on the floating screen and a series of images appeared, detailed scans of Thomas's internal body structure. The aliens gathered around, making clicking sounds that Thomas guessed was their version of surprised conversation. "Commander, look at these healing patterns," Officer Han said, pointing to several areas on the scan. "Multiple fractures in the left leg, healed. 4 ribs show evidence of past breaks. The right shoulder has been reconstructed, and here, metal fragments embedded near the spine." Commander Do leaned closer. "Battle injuries?" "Most likely," Han confirmed. "And this is unusual. His pain receptors show signs of conditioning. This human has experienced significant trauma, but developed resistance to it." Thomas knew exactly what they were seeing: the roadmap of his 40-year career. The broken leg, from a parachute drop gone wrong in '83, the ribs from hand-to-hand combat in Kabul, the shoulder from that extraction in South America that went sideways, and the shrapnel? That was Tehran '79. The doctors had said it was too risky to remove all of it. "Let's test his physical limitations," Commander Do ordered. 2 guards approached and released the restraints holding Thomas to the table. They gestured for him to stand, which he did slowly, playing up his age with a slight grimace and stiff movements. "Walk to that wall and back," ordered Officer Kang, a stockier alien with dark markings across his face. Thomas did as instructed, carefully, maintaining his facade of an old man's gait, slightly shuffling, a bit hunched. He could have moved normally, even sprinted if needed, but information was power. Let them underestimate him. "Now some basic strength assessments," Kang said, pointing to what looked like exercise equipment modified for human use. For the next hour, they put Thomas through increasingly demanding physical tests, measuring his strength, endurance, and reaction time. Thomas was careful to perform just slightly below his actual capabilities, showing enough strength to suggest he was fit for his age, but nothing that would reveal his true abilities. "His performance is typical for an elderly human male," Kang reported, seeming disappointed. "Perhaps we should have selected a younger specimen." Commander Du wasn't convinced. "There's something unusual about this one. His vital signs haven't fluctuated despite the exertion, and he hasn't asked a single question about why he's here." Thomas was placed in what appeared to be an interrogation room next, a small chamber with metallic walls and a single table with 2 chairs. Officer June, who Thomas guessed was some kind of psychological specialist, sat across from him. "Are you afraid?" June asked directly. Thomas looked into the alien's large, dark eyes. "Should I be?" June tilted his head slightly. "Most humans would show fear in this situation. You do not." Thomas shrugged. "Being afraid doesn't change anything." "You've faced death before," June stated rather than asked. "Everyone my age has had close calls," Thomas replied evasively. June leaned forward. "We will now examine your mind. It will be uncomfortable." Two assistants entered, carrying a device that looked like a crown made of shimmering metal. They placed it on Thomas's head despite his minor show of resistance, just enough to seem normal, but not enough to truly fight it. As the device activated, Thomas felt the alien presence attempting to push into his thoughts. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, and he was ready. During his time in special operations, Thomas had undergone extensive training in resistance to various interrogation techniques, including experimental work with psychic resistance when the government briefly explored such programs in the 80s. He allowed the aliens to see harmless surface memories, fishing at his favorite lake, tending his garden, reading books by the fireplace. But when they tried to probe deeper, they encountered something unexpected: mental barriers, carefully constructed and maintained. June's eyes widened. "He's blocking us," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "This shouldn't be possible for a human mind." The intensity of the mental probe increased, and Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead as he fought to maintain control. It was like invisible hands trying to pry open a door in his mind. He focused on his training, using the old techniques to compartmentalize his thoughts. After several minutes, June switched off the device, looking both frustrated and intrigued. "This human's mind is unusually disciplined," he reported to Commander Du, who had been observing. "Either humans have developed significantly since our last survey, or this specimen is exceptional." Thomas removed the crown when they didn't stop him, setting it carefully on the table, a small act of defiance that didn't go unnoticed. "You resist our procedures," Commander Du said, stepping closer to study Thomas. "Why? What are you hiding?" Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Everyone has private thoughts." "Take him to holding cell 3, Commander Du ordered the guards. "We will try more direct methods tomorrow." As they led him away, Thomas caught snippets of conversation between the aliens. "Something isn't right about this human," June was saying. "He shows no fear. His mind has defenses we haven't seen before, and those injury patterns suggest combat experience." "Perhaps we should check Earth records," suggested Officer Hahn. "Find out who he was before retirement." Thomas almost smiled. They were finally asking the right questions. By tomorrow, they'd know exactly who and what they had brought aboard their ship, and by then it might already be too late for them. In his cell, Thomas sat on the edge of the simple bed they'd provided, closed his eyes, and began preparing himself mentally and physically for what would come next. His body might be older now, his joints stiffer, but his mind was as sharp as ever, and in his world, the mind had always been the deadliest weapon. Thomas woke instantly when the cell door slid open. Years of training had taught him to transition from sleep to full alertness in seconds, a skill that had saved his life countless times. Officer Tay entered, flanked by 2 guards. Unlike the others, Tay's blue skin had a slight purplish tint, and symbols on his uniform suggested he outranked most of the crew Thomas had seen so far. "Our standard methods are proving ineffective," Tay said without preamble. "So we're moving to deep memory extraction." Thomas sat up slowly, maintaining his elderly facade. "Sounds serious." "It is," Tay replied, studying Thomas carefully. "Most subjects don't survive the process intact. Their minds break." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "And what happens if I say no?" The alien made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You misunderstand. This isn't a request." The guards moved forward, gripping Thomas by the arms and lifting him to his feet. He allowed himself to be led down the corridor, seemingly compliant but mentally cataloging every turn, every door, every potential weapon. Old habits. They brought him to a chamber dominated by a chair surrounded by complex machinery. It reminded Thomas of the electric chair he'd once seen during a prison infiltration mission back in '92, though this version had far more wires and pulsing lights. Commander Dew stood waiting, speaking with a smaller alien hunched over a control panel. They both turned as Thomas entered. "Secure him," Dew ordered. The guards pushed Thomas into the chair. Metal restraints automatically closed around his wrists, ankles, and forehead, holding him firmly in place. "Last chance," Thomas said quietly. "You really don't want to see what's in my head." Dew ignored him, nodding to the technician. "Begin." The extraction. A helmet-like device lowered from above, settling over Thomas's head. Unlike the previous mind probe, this machine didn't just skirt the surface of his thoughts, it plunged deep, breaking through his mental barriers with brute force. Thomas grunted in pain, his body tensing against the restraints. He tried to maintain his defenses, but this technology was beyond anything he'd been trained to resist. The aliens weren't just reading his memories, they were experiencing them, and so were all the aliens watching through the monitoring screens. The first memory burst forth like a dam breaking. Jungle, night, Vietnam, 1971. Thomas, barely 20, moves silently through thick foliage. 4 enemy soldiers stand guard around a hidden bunker. Thomas has no backup, no extraction plan, just a mission: neutralize the target inside. He moves like a ghost, knife glinting once in the moonlight, before disappearing into the throat of the first guard. No sound. The second doesn't even turn before Thomas reaches him. 20 seconds later, all 4 guards are down, and Thomas is inside the bunker. The memory shifted, spinning forward through time. A snow-covered mountain outpost in East Germany, 1983. Thomas, now hardened and experienced, infiltrates a Soviet listening post alone. The file he recovers will prevent a nuclear confrontation that no one will ever know almost happened. Another shift. Desert heat, Iraq, 1991. Thomas leads a small team behind enemy lines. Their mission doesn't exist on any official record. The intelligence they gather saves thousands of lives, but no one will ever know their names. More memories flooded through. Thomas interrogating a high-value target using techniques that made conventional torture look merciful. Thomas surviving 3 weeks alone in hostile territory after a mission went wrong, living off the land while evading capture. Thomas eliminating a terrorist cell single-handedly when an operation was compromised and his team was killed. Throughout the ship, aliens watched in growing horror as the truth about their helpless elderly captive was revealed. This wasn't just any human. This was something else entirely. A weapon shaped like a man, with decades of experience in dealing death and completing impossible missions. In the control room, Commander Dew stared at the screens, mandibles twitching, in what might have been fear. "Shut it down," he ordered finally. "Shut it down now." The technician hurriedly disengaged the memory extractor. Thomas slumped in the chair, breathing heavily, sweat soaking his clothes. But when he raised his head, his eyes were clear and focused. The pretense of frailty was gone. "I warned you," he said simply. The room was silent. The aliens looked at each other nervously. Science Officer Tay approached cautiously. "What are you?" he asked. Thomas smiled thinly. "Just a soldier. One who should have been left in retirement." "Your species," Commander Dew began, then faltered. "These memories. Your kind sends individuals to do what entire military units should handle. Special forces," Thomas explained. "Every major nation on Earth has them. Men and women trained to achieve objectives against impossible odds." He flexed his hands, testing the restraints subtly. "I was just one of many." Dew turned to his officers, speaking rapidly in their alien language. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Panic. Finally, Dew turned back to Thomas. "The extraction showed us something else. A term. What is Black Ops?" Thomas looked directly into the alien's large eyes. "Operations that don't officially exist. Missions without oversight or rules. The things governments need done but can't acknowledge. He paused. I spent 40 years doing those missions. The implications weren't lost on the aliens. Earth wasn't just a planet of primitive beings. It was a world that produced humans like Thomas, trained killers who operated in shadows, accomplished the impossible, and then simply went home to tend their gardens. How many like you are there? Officer Tay asked. Thomas shrugged as much as the restraints would allow. Thousands active at any given time, tens of thousands retired, from every country, every background. Some better than me, some worse. And this is just one type of your warriors, Commander Du said, more statement than question. Special forces are just the scalpel, Thomas replied. We also have hammers, very big hammers. As they led Thomas back to his cell, the atmosphere on the ship had changed dramatically. Guards who had previously shown contempt now kept their distance, weapons held ready but not aimed directly at him. They were afraid. Back in his cell, Thomas sat on the edge of his bed and waited. He'd seen the fear in their eyes, watched them reassess everything they thought they knew about humans. They now understood they hadn't captured a helpless specimen. They'd captured a predator. And predators, even old ones, were most dangerous when cornered. Thomas closed his eyes and began systematically relaxing his muscles, group by group, a technique he'd learned decades ago to prepare for action. The aliens had made a critical mistake. In their invasion planning, they'd assumed technological superiority equated to victory. They hadn't accounted for what humans like Thomas had spent centuries perfecting, the art of war. Thomas watched the guard rotation outside his cell for the third time. Exactly 14 minutes between shifts. The aliens were nothing if not precise. Since the memory extraction, security around him had doubled, with armed guards constantly positioned outside his door and regular patrols passing by every few minutes. They knew what he was now, which made them cautious. But they still underestimated him. Their mistake was bringing him to the medical bay after the memory extraction. While they checked him for neural damage, Thomas had pocketed 3 small items: a thin metal instrument that looked like a scalpel, a vial of some kind of sedative they'd prepared but never used, and most importantly, a small communication device that had been left momentarily unattended. Now sitting in his cell, Thomas carefully examined the comm device hidden in his palm. It was roughly the size of a quarter, with tiny symbols etched on its surface. During his examinations, he'd watched the aliens use similar devices to control doors, lights, and various ship systems. This one appeared to be low clearance, but it might be enough. A faint vibration ran through the floor, the third such tremor in the past hour. Thomas had felt enough ship engines in his time to recognize the signs of mechanical trouble. The aliens were having power issues. Perfect timing, he whispered to himself. He needed to move soon. From overheard conversations, Thomas knew the aliens had accelerated their invasion timeline after discovering what they were truly up against. A larger fleet was already on its way to Earth. The cell door slid open, and Officer Kang entered with a food tray. Unlike before, Kang now stood at a respectful distance, watching Thomas warily. "Eat," Kang ordered, setting the tray down without getting too close. Thomas nodded, noticing the subtle tremor in Kang's hands. Good. Fear made people, even alien people, careless. The ship seems to be having some problems, Thomas remarked, casually, picking at the unidentifiable food they'd provided. Engine trouble? Kang stiffened. None of your concern. I worked on engines once. Thomas continued conversationally. Fixed them in the field when I had to. Maybe I could help. Humans could not possibly understand our technology, Kang said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Thomas shrugged. Just trying to be helpful. After all, if the ship loses power, completely, we'd all be in trouble. Kang left without responding, but Thomas could see the seed of doubt had been planted. The aliens were growing desperate about their mechanical problems. He could use that. 15 minutes later, the lights flickered once, twice, then dimmed to emergency levels. The vibration in the floor intensified briefly before smoothing out. Thomas smiled to himself. Time to move. He pressed what he believed was the activation pattern on the stolen comm device. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, the cell door mechanism clicked softly. Thomas pushed gently and the door slid open just enough for him to slip through. The guard who should have been outside was hurrying down the corridor, presumably to help with the power issues. Moving silently, despite his age, Thomas made his way through the dimly lit hallways. His first objective, find a way to communicate with Earth. His second, disable this ship before the invasion fleet arrived. He encountered his first alien near what appeared to be a maintenance junction. The blue-skinned technician was focused on an open panel, muttering to himself in his alien language. Thomas approached silently from behind, one hand holding the makeshift sedative applicator he'd fashioned from the stolen medical items. A quick jab to the neck, one hand over the alien's mouth to muffle any sound, and the technician slumped unconscious. Thomas dragged him into a nearby alcove and quickly stripped him of his utility belt and identification tags. 2 more corridors, another unconscious alien, and Thomas found what he was looking for: an auxiliary control room. Unlike the main bridge, this room was staffed by only 2 technicians, both frantically working to stabilize the ship's systems during the power fluctuation. They never saw him coming. Minutes later, Thomas sat at the alien console, the 2 technicians, bound and unconscious nearby. He studied the symbols carefully, correlating them with what he'd observed during his captivity. Special Forces training had included quick adaptation to unfamiliar equipment, and Thomas had always had a knack for technology. On one of the screens, he located what looked like internal security feeds. Images flashed across the display. Aliens rushing through corridors, Commander Dew barking orders on the bridge, repair crews working on smoking equipment. And there, on another screen, a search party discovering his empty cell. The alarm would sound soon. He needed to work faster. Thomas found the ship's communication array and, after some careful experimentation, managed to access it. But who could he contact? The military? They'd never believe him in time. No, he needed to think strategically. Instead of trying to send a message to Earth, Thomas focused on the ship's database. Information was power, and he needed to understand what humanity was facing. The files were extensive: detailed plans for a full-scale invasion, planetary assessment reports, military capabilities analysis. Thomas downloaded everything he could onto a storage device he'd taken from one of the technicians. Suddenly, the door slid open. A security team led by Officer Sung burst in, weapons raised. "Stand away from the console," Sung barked. Thomas raised his hand slowly, but he was smiling. Too late. With a casual flick of his fingers, he activated the command sequence he'd prepared. A feedback loop in the ship's power systems that would cause cascading failures throughout the vessel. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to cripple it temporarily. The lights went out completely. Emergency sirens wailed as backup systems tried to compensate for the overload. In the red glow of emergency lighting, Thomas moved. Years melted away as decades of training took over. Despite his age, his body remembered what to do. The first guard went down with a precise strike to what Thomas hoped was a vulnerable nerve cluster. The second fired his weapon, but Thomas was already moving, the energy blast hitting the wall where he'd stood a moment before. Thomas grabbed the weapon as the alien fell, examining it quickly before turning it on the remaining guards. The weapon fired with minimal recoil, dropping the aliens where they stood. "Still got it," Thomas muttered, stepping over the unconscious bodies. In the confusion that followed, Thomas moved through the ship like a ghost from the past. The operative he'd once been, the weapon his government had created. Security cameras captured glimpses of him methodically taking control of key ship sections. The engine room, the weapons bay, auxiliary life support. On the main bridge, Commander Dew watched the security feeds in horror as his crew fell one by one to this single human. "How is this possible?" he demanded of no one in particular. "He's just one old human." Officer Tay, standing beside him, could only shake his head. "We chose the wrong human," he said simply. An alert sounded on the main console. All engine functions were now locked out. Life support was operating on minimum levels. And the weapons systems were completely offline. The bridge doors slid open and Thomas Jenkins stood framed in the entrance, alien weapon in hand, looking nothing like the frail old man they'd abducted. He stood straight, his eyes clear and focused, his movements precise and controlled. "I believe," Thomas said calmly, "that we need to have a serious discussion about your invasion plans." Commander Du looked at the human who had single-handedly taken control of his ship, and for the first time in his long military career he felt true fear, not for himself, but for his entire species. Because if this was what one elderly human could do, what would they face from an entire planet of them? The bridge fell silent as Thomas walked casually toward the command chair where Commander Du sat, frozen in disbelief. The remaining bridge crew backed away, weapons lowered. They'd seen enough through the ship's monitoring system to know that resistance would be pointless. "Your invasion won't succeed," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm giving you the chance to save a lot of lives, yours and ours." Commander Du's large eyes narrowed. "You've disabled our ship and neutralized my crew, but you're still just one human. Our fleet is already on the way." Thomas smiled slightly. "That's why we're going to have a chat with them." He gestured toward the communication console with the alien weapon. The technology was advanced, but weapons were weapons, and Thomas had handled everything from Vietnam-era rifles to prototype sonic disruptors during his long career. "Open a channel to your high command," he ordered. Officer Jin, the communications specialist, looked to Commander Du for permission. After a tense moment, Du nodded. "Do it," he said quietly. "Let him speak." Jin's slender blue fingers moved across the console's surface. A large view screen at the front of the bridge flickered to life, revealing what appeared to be a war room filled with high-ranking aliens. Their ornate uniforms and posture of authority made their status clear even across species barriers. A particularly large alien with elaborate head crests leaned forward, surprise evident on his face. "Commander Du, explain this immediately," he demanded. "Why is a human on your bridge? And why have we lost telemetry from your vessel?" Thomas stepped forward before Du could respond. "I'll be handling this conversation," he said. "My name is Thomas Jenkins, citizen of Earth. Your survey team made a serious error when they decided to abduct me." The alien commander's surprise turned to outrage. "A primitive species does not dictate terms to the Gook Dominion. Commander Du, regain control of your vessel immediately." "He can't," Thomas said simply. "I've locked out all critical systems. This ship isn't going anywhere without my cooperation." He turned to Jin. "Show them the footage from the last 12 hours. Jin hesitated, then complied when Thomas raised the weapon slightly. The view screen split, and footage began playing showing Thomas's systematic takeover of the ship. Neutralizing guards with practiced efficiency, navigating complex ship systems, outthinking and outmaneuvering technologically superior forces. At every turn, Thomas let them watch for a few minutes, then signaled Jin to stop the playback. "That's me," he said to the silent alien command. "I'm 78 years old and retired. I'm not even in good shape anymore." He let that sink in before continuing. "I spent my career in what we call special operations, covert missions, usually alone, or with minimal support, against superior forces, the kind of work that requires creative problem-solving." He paused, then spoke more forcefully. "Your invasion plans show you've drastically underestimated humanity. You've studied our technology, our conventional military capabilities, but you missed something crucial." "And what might that be?" the alien commander asked, his tone now cautious. "We've been fighting wars against each other for our entire history," Thomas explained. "We've gotten very, very good at it. Your technology is superior, yes, but technology alone doesn't win conflicts. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Our own history is filled with technologically superior forces being defeated by determined, adaptable opponents." Thomas walked closer to the screen. "If one old retired operative can take over your advanced survey vessel, imagine what would happen if you faced our active military forces, our special operators, our billions of civilians who would resist, occupation with everything they have." He gestured around the bridge. Your invasion plan assumes our military bases are your primary targets. But humans don't need bases to fight. We improvise. We adapt. Every tool becomes a weapon. Every home becomes a fortress. Every citizen becomes a soldier when pushed far enough. The High Commander was silent for a long moment, studying Thomas, with an intensity that suggested he was finally taking the humans seriously. "You've made your point. Effectively," he finally said. "But why should we believe one human represents your entire species?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't. I'm just one example, but I've included a data package that might convince you." He nodded to Jin. "Send them the files I prepared." Jin looked to Commander Doe, who nodded grimly. With a few quick motions, the communication specialist transmitted the data. On the screen, the alien leaders reacted as they received the files. A carefully selected history of human warfare, focusing on guerrilla campaigns, resistance movements, and special operations successes. Throughout Earth's history, Vietnam farmers defeating American forces, Afghan tribesmen repelling Soviet invasion, the Winter War where tiny Finland held off Stalin's army. Detailed analyses of unconventional warfare tactics, profiles of special forces capabilities from countries around the world, and estimates of how these would adapt to counter-alien technology. "This is just a small sample," Thomas said as they reviewed the data. "There are billions of us. We're divided. We fight amongst ourselves, but we unite quickly against outside threats. An invasion wouldn't end with a quick victory. It would become a prolonged, bloody conflict that would cost you dearly, even if you eventually won." The High Commander turned to confer with his subordinates, their conversation inaudible. When he turned back, his demeanor had changed. "We will reconsider our approach to your planet," he said carefully. "You've provided much to evaluate." Thomas nodded. "That's all I ask. A reconsideration." He turned to Commander Doe. "I'm returning control of your ship now. Take your crew and go home. Tell them what you've seen, what one old human can do." He placed the weapon on a nearby console and tapped a sequence into the command system, releasing the lockouts he'd placed on the ship's functions. "The coordinates for your home system are already programmed in," Thomas said. "I've left your crew unharmed. Those that needed medical attention have been treated. They'll recover." Commander Doe stood slowly. "You're letting us go? Just like that?" Thomas nodded. "I was a soldier, not an executioner. And sometimes the best way to win a war is to convince your enemy not to fight it in the first place." He stepped back, hands open at his sides. "Besides, you need to deliver my message personally. Make them understand what they'd be facing." 3 days later, Thomas Jenkins stood on the porch of his mountain cabin, watching the sunrise paint the Appalachian forests in gold and crimson. His garden needed weeding, and the roof had a leak he'd been meaning to fix. The bruises from his time on the alien ship were already fading. The only evidence of his ordeal was a small alien communication device he'd kept, insurance in case. The Gook Dominion reconsidered their decision. Thomas smiled as he sipped his morning coffee. He didn't think they would. Commander Doe's eyes had held a new respect when they parted. The respect of one soldier for another, transcending species differences. The small device in his pocket suddenly warmed slightly. A signal appeared on its tiny screen. The invasion fleet had changed course, heading away from Earth. Thomas nodded to himself and slipped the device back into his pocket. Maybe now he could finally enjoy his retirement in peace. At least, until the next time someone made the mistake of thinking an old man was an easy target. He chuckled to himself as he headed toward his garden tools. After all those years of secret missions, his most important one had come after retirement, showing an alien race that humans were not to be underestimated. And somewhere out in the stars, a race of blue-skinned beings was carefully revising their assessment of the small blue planet they'd once considered an easy conquest, all because they'd chosen the wrong human to abduct. The old saying was true after all. Age and treachery would always overcome youth and skill. Even when the youth had spaceships,